So welcome everyone. It is my pleasure today to host the Stronger Together virtual writing retreat, where we invite scholars to join a themed reflection on writing and a writing session. My name is Aldona Kapacinskaite. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Management and Technology here at Bocconi University, and I am a member of the STR Membership Engagement Committee. Today, we will spend the first hour listening and asking questions to our esteemed panelists, and the second hour will be devoted to a quiet writing time in this kind of Zoom community setup. Today's theme, as you can see, is This is How I Write, Editors' Perspectives, and we're very lucky to have 4 editors on the panel. Our first panelist is Olivier Chatain, who is an associate professor in the Strategy and Business Policy Department at HEC Paris. He's an associate editor at the Strategic Management Journal and an editorial board member at Strategy Science. Second, we have Luis Diestre, professor of strategy at IE Business School. Luis has a long tenure as a member of the editorial review board of the Academy of Management Journal and the Strategic Management Journal, and he currently serves as an associate editor of the Academy of Management Journal. Our third panelist is Giada Di Stefano, an associate professor in the Department of Management and Technology at Bocconi University. She has been a long-standing member of the editorial board of the Strategic Management Journal and Strategic Organization, and is an associate editor at the Strategic Management Journal. And finally, our fourth panelist is Caroline Flammer. She's an associate professor of strategy and innovation at Boston University. Caroline is currently an editor at both the Strategic Management Journal and Management Science. So I asked our panelists to share with us their insights broadly related to this topic of This is How I Write. So their routines, their hacks, all their insights and observations as editors at our top journals and as writers. And in particular, I asked them to share what they notice when they edit manuscripts that are submitted by scholars for whom English may not be their first language, like myself. So with this introduction, I will ask Olivier and then Luis and then Giada and Caroline to share their insights. And we will proceed with the Q&A after the 4 interventions. Please post your questions in the chat and I will moderate the conversation. I will ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question to the panelists who you want to answer your question. So with that, thanks so much. And Olivier, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Aldona. Do you see my slides? Yes, okay. Yes. So first, I also would like to thank Giada for her words about Will Mitchell. I feel like I'm part of the extended family, or the illegitimate family. I guess I'm not a direct descendant, but I am a cousin, and I benefited a lot from his generosity and his commitment to scholarship. So I think we are all sadder today than yesterday. Anyway, so let's go to business and to writing and how I write. I thought that I would probably maybe present more my views as a writer and as I learned how to write in this profession rather than as an editor. By the time papers come to journals, they are mostly well polished. Okay, so it's rare that you have papers that really are the language is really problematic. So I don't think that's really the most important thing. I think it's more how do you get to something that people will enjoy reading and will find it interesting, and that will help you get your ideas across. So let me start a little bit about my own process of writing. So the first thing I notice is that the world is against you. Okay, the world is not interested in your writing. I'm not a natural writer. I cannot just sit down and write. That's very hard for me because we have so many distractions around us, and we can deplore it. We can be sad about it, but that's a reality. So we have to find ways around it, and it's never easy. So if you think, oh, it's so hard for me to write, you're not the only person in that case. I think most of us are in that situation. So how to do it? I mean, so the key is to really to trick your mind into, because the person who prevents you from writing is your brain, who's just basically telling you, look, that's not gonna lead nowhere, so why should I even start? And the way I think about it is that on the one hand, no step is too small to get to write something somewhere, because the key is really to get going. And the second thing is that whatever, I mean, the means to get to writing something doesn't matter. So whatever it takes, okay? It's a famous sentence. So I'm trying to typically have some, when I find it hard to read, I go back to pencil and paper and write a few things in a page. And these are terrible keywords, half-formed sentences. And then I try to make a crappy outline in the text editor, so I don't even have to think about the form. And because of that, I'll be able to start getting into the process, and it's going to get easier. So the thing is that you have to, the first 30 minutes of a writing session can be very painful, and you feel you cannot even start. But after that, it's much easier. So you have to have enough time ahead of you, and your brain needs to know it has enough time for you to allow yourself to get into that state where it's a bit easier to write. So when it comes to starting a new project and write something new, again, I try to convince myself, at least my brain, that's the other person in my mind, right? That I do have something to say, because another thing that is usually a hurdle for writing is the impression that what is there new to say about this? Everything I know, it seems totally obvious and trivial. And the key is to have, okay, let me at least write down a little bit of a summary of what I want to say, and then I'll find a way that would convince myself that it is worth writing. And once I'm into the act of writing, it's going to get better. But that first hurdle can be very, very tough and very hard. And you know, even after many, many years of writing, because our profession is essentially writing at the end of the day, it's not something that I find necessarily easy. And I guess it's probably the same for many people. Writing is the one part, but editing is actually most of what you do. Once you have a draft, then your goal is to get a crappy draft, and then you spend a lot of time editing. That means that first you have to take that seriously. That's really your job, is to edit. That's what you want to get to, because this is where you go from half-formed thought to something that starts to make sense. And there's going to be constant cutting and adding and reordering. And you have to be ruthless with yourself, because it's not that because you like a sentence, that you have a nice turn of phrase, but you should keep it. So it's a process of constant, it's a big work in progress, and you have to go through it. So it's messy. You have to embrace that messiness. So that would be at least one of the things that I've come to maybe to appreciate more as I'm doing it. Your paper is never going to leave you fully formed and ready from the first draft. There's going to be many drafts, and between the first draft and the last draft, there might be almost nothing in common, okay, except the process that tied the first thing to the last thing, but the last thing is actually good. Now, let's talk about the language. I really appreciated the focus on what do you do when English is not your native language. So the first thing for all of you for whom English is not your native language, whatever you know about your own language, you can basically forget about it. All the norms you've learned. Look, I was, before my PhD, I was educated mostly in French, and I was pretty good about it. First, I'm no longer good about it because I'm unable to write in French anymore, but basically everything I learned, I had to unlearn. So just let it go. Okay, it's a different language. The norms are what they are. Don't even question them. It is what it is. So you have to get into that mode. Okay, so that mode is a strange dialect, which is mostly American English. If you look actually at the guidelines for strategic management journal, they say the language is American English. It's not British English. So it's already there are already two different languages. Okay, and with different norms, and you have to learn them. So there are a lot of conventions. So for instance, when I did my PhD, I learned what a topic sentence was. And if you don't know what a topic sentence is, you should learn about it, because this is the way the papers are being written. Every paragraph starts with one sentence that describes what the paragraph is about, and et cetera, et cetera. These are, you may like it or not. That's not at all how I went through French higher education, but that's what I had to learn. So you have to do it. Kids who are learning American English, they are learning this in primary school. Okay, so you just have to accept it. Okay, so accept that you're starting from scratch. Now, in terms of style, so this is where I think that actually being a native speaker can be a bit of a disadvantage, because as a native speaker, you have too much vocabulary. So you have too many synonyms in your mind. So I would be a little bit provocative here, but not too much. So first, simplicity is important, because, okay, even though you could write in a beautiful poetic style in your native language, forget about it. Your goal is to write simply and clearly. Okay? And that means that most of the adjectives and adverbs you use in English, usually you don't really need them, and you could probably cut them out and your sentence would communicate the same thing. One thing about English specifically is that verbs are really the spirit of that language is in the verbs, okay? And that's really what you want to have, verbs that are very evocative. So this is where you can make your writing more impactful. One thing is a pet peeve of mine, because we're academic, we want to be pedantic. So sometimes we use verbs that have more of a Latin or French root, just to be more pedantic, but actually you have a stronger impact by using the simpler version. So for instance, every time I read utilize, which we have in French, for instance, I'm like, but use, what about use? It says the same thing, just less pedantic. So a good trick is shorter verbs. They tend to have a more Germanic root, and they are more impactful in English. Anyway, but so simplicity and repetition. You've been probably told that variety is important. That, I have to use different synonyms so I can show off all of my vocabulary. It's a terrible idea when you write a paper. It's a terrible idea because you're going to confuse your reader about what you're talking about. So there are all the important concepts. You have to use the same words exactly again and again in the same phrases. Because if you don't do that, you're going to confuse your reader. And your reader may not understand why you are confused, but they will nevertheless be confused. So simplicity and repetition, good. Variety and synonyms, bad. No, this is what got you a prize in high school, but no, don't do that. Okay, or only do that when you're commenting about something, but not about the fundamental concepts. Now, the last thing is idioms. So a bit provocative, but it can be very, very bad because sports metaphors are the worst. Because even in English, depending on which country people are coming from, they don't necessarily understand. So you can mix metaphors, this first down was a home run, and now it's a new ball game. And I've probably mixed 3 or 4 different sports here from different continents. I mean, you don't want me to use my... so if I use a metaphor, it's always going to be for something that is not essential to the argument. Because I know that most of your audience doesn't necessarily have native English as a starting point, and they're not necessarily got higher education in an English-speaking country, and so you may lose them. So use them strategically. So you have to be really conscious of that. So paradoxically, I would say that everything that made you a great student in your native language, probably don't try to replicate that in English, because that may lead you astray. Paper structure, a couple of things that will be done shortly is that you have to understand that readers have little time and attention. And so you need to know exactly what they know so you can present them what they need to know at the right time. So they don't think that it is either trivial or too complicated. The corollary is that you really know exactly who you're writing to. You need to know what is in the head of your audience. So this is why going to conferences is really useful, because you see how people interact, and that gives you some insight about what is taken for granted and what is not. So you really need to know the audience for writing. I'm not talking about grammar, I'm really talking about what arguments you're using, what ideas you're putting forth. Flow is more important than logic. So maybe here, this is my own French upbringing, that that was causing trouble is that we, in my French education, it's very important to have a very logical and symmetric argument with, you have 3 parts, 3 subparts, 3 subparts. It's like a beautiful garden. That doesn't work at all. So that's the worst thing the thing that was hardest for me to unlearn. Because your readers have little attention, it's all about finding the sequence of argument that is always keeping them with you. So that the moment something becomes a bit hard, they are promised that something easy is going to come. Okay, so sometimes you have to change the order in which you explain things to get a totally different impact, and that's very, very important. Now, how do you learn that? You have to spend the time to explicitly reverse engineer what maybe your senior co-authors do. I mean, down to the paragraph, down to, okay, well, in that part, why are these paragraphs in that order? What function do they fulfill? I remember after a writing session with my advisors, I basically, I see the recipe he's using, but never making explicit. I'm going to write this down. And so I had that template of, okay, you have to start with this, that paragraph does that, then you have this. And these are things you need to learn and observe by yourself. There are a lot of good sources, and I'm going to finish on that. There are 2 books that, at least to me, were useful to learn how to make an argument that would be understood, because I think part of that is also, I would say, culturally specific, and the norm is, again, we're mostly using a form of American English. So you have to learn how people are taught to write in American English in academia, and otherwise you'll be at a disadvantage. So one of the best for that was The Craft of Research. There are a couple of chapters on how to make arguments, which when I was in the darkest stages of my PhD were really saving me and helping me unblock myself. I'm like, stop doubting myself. And for more my contemporary struggles, there is a good book on what it means to try to write when the world is really set against you. That's a book by Jolie Jensen called Write No Matter What, which sometimes a bit uplifting and tells you how to do it. And finally, there are many resources from an author called Raul Pacheco Vega, who's big on Twitter, but he has a fantastic website. And I've been using this recently because I was a bit stuck on something, and that helped me, okay, how should I start writing that project, because I had trouble. And so that's a process that's going to keep on happening. You're not done, I know how to write. You just keep on learning how to write. And so, but to keep on learning how to write, you have to start learning how to write. So do it now. And that's all for me.
Thanks so much, Olivier. So I actually had the opposite problem from you. If we can transition to Luis, I was going from the English-speaking system to French when I was studying in France. And so my writing was too barren, too straightforward for everybody. And now it's just stuck in the middle.
Not enough flourish, I know. But well, I mean, the point now, I cannot write in French anymore the way I could. I mean, it's just pathetic.
Okay, we got Luis. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Aldona. Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to present some of my insights about writing tips. It's funny that I'm going to talk about these writing tips from a very different angle to the one that Olivier was presenting, but I think we end up in the same point. So there's going to be a bit of overlap, which I think is good, I guess. So the way I thought about sharing some of my experiences, maybe more as an editor, on how to provide advice or recommendations on how to write academic papers, comes from the something I've experienced in the last years, which is when you're reading a paper, supposedly what you want to have is a clear understanding of the message that the authors are trying to convey. But as a reader, sometimes you find yourself rereading some parts of the paper, right? So I think that these are, in a way, alerts or signals that there's something wrong with the way the paper has been written. And I have some insights here about what kind of problems, of underlying weaknesses are these activities signaling, right? So let me start with one. I find myself many times, I'm sure this happens to you as well, that you need to reread a sentence that you've read. It could be your fault, that maybe you're not smart enough to understand it, or you're tired or whatever, but sometimes it signals there's a reason for that, right? So clearly, obviously, if you need to reread the sentence, it's because the sentence was not clear. Why was the sentence not clear? I think this speaks a little bit with some of the issues that Olivier was mentioning. And I think depending on where you're coming from, this is more of a problem or less. I'm from Spain. I think Spanish and French and similar languages usually use very long sentences. And I think we're very ambitious. We try to put lots of stuff in a single sentence. And that's not necessarily a good idea when we are talking about English and specifically about academic language. So maybe this signals that the sentence is too long, too complex, is trying to be too ambitious. Maybe it's better to split it in a couple of sentences or 3 sentences. Maybe signaling something worse, which is maybe it's not clear what you had in your mind when you were trying to write the sentence down, right? So something like this, a mistake I make a lot, which is you feel that a sentence is not completely clear, but you hope that the reader, by reading the previous one and the next one, they will figure it out. They will extrapolate and understand what you mean. I think this is a huge mistake. You don't want to be lazy, and you want to make sure that the sentence stands in itself by itself, that it's clear what you're saying. Of course, you cannot understand the whole the sentence without reading the whole paper, but at the very, very abstract level, you should really understand what the sentence is trying to convey, right? That's one of the underlying problems that we could create confusion to the readers. Sometimes I find myself rereading a whole paragraph or a group of sentences, right? I think the reason for this is that maybe the sentences are not well connected. The reasons why the sentences are not well connected and the paragraph does not seem to make sense is maybe they are not linked in a logical way. I'm a huge fan of these sort of connectors, like therefore, however. This really gives a clear signal to the reader what is the purpose of the next sentence compared to the previous one. So it keeps the flow of the logic, and it really helps the reader understand what is coming afterwards. I think this is something actually I don't think I completely disagree, but it's some certain point of confusion opposition with what Olivier was saying before. I agree with repetition, but I think too little repetition is not good, but too much repetition is not good either. Sometimes, and this is a mistake I make a lot, which is you feel that the message is not clear in a single sentence. You keep adding the same idea, but with different words, and you have 2 or 3 sentences or 4 sentences saying somehow the same. So hoping that by repeating things from different points of view, the reader will understand what you're saying. The problem with this, I feel, is that you're asking too much from the reader. You're asking the reader to store lots of information in their brain, lots of short-term memories being used for that. So maybe this is not good. At some point, you want the reader to release that information, and so you can move to the next point, right? So you're asking lots of cognitive activity from the reader. So that's something you want to make sure. Ideally, if each sentence plays a unique role, and then you can move to the next, I think this helps a lot. There's something also, one of the reasons why maybe sometimes paragraphs do not make sense or sentences do not fit well together is because maybe they lack a clear example. I think examples help a lot. But bad examples are even worse than not using examples, right? If you have the reader at a very high level of abstraction and suddenly you move into an example, you better have an example that perfectly fits what the abstraction is suggesting. Otherwise, it creates lots of confusion. So examples are useful, but if you don't have a good example, better not to use it, right? So that's one advice I think I've found over the time. Some other thing I find myself doing when you're reading or reviewing papers is that you're reading and at some point you say, I completely missed it. There's something I didn't understand. There's something I missed. Some part of the paper I was not really paying attention to, and you need to go back several pages back, right? So that's a huge problem. If you're doing that, there's something wrong with the paper, right? What is the reason why you're doing that? Maybe there's some arguments that you're reading that don't seem to make sense. It's not what you had in mind, what the authors were trying to say, and you see that there's something that looks like sort of in conflict with what they were saying before. Maybe they're using constructs that seem to mean something different to what you thought they meant. What is the underlying problem for those types of confusion? First, maybe clearly is that simply the constructs were not well defined. Maybe this is a signal that the constructs were not clearly defined ex ante, or the use of synonyms like Olivier was saying before. Maybe 2 words mean the same for you, but not for other people. So sticking to the same concept is a good idea. And if you define those concepts or constructs very clearly from the beginning, that really helps avoid lots of confusion. Maybe there's some underlying assumptions that were not clearly made explicit or were not justified. And that's why I think the arguments meant something and they mean something completely different, right? So there's lots of confusion that could be removed by making things clear at the beginning. in terms of defining constructs, defining the assumptions, the world you're going to build your theory or your arguments around. Make that clear from the beginning, and that saves lots of problems in the future. Then something else I found myself doing a lot is that you're reading, and at some point you need to move forward. You move to other parts of the paper, like the empirics or the sample or the predictions, right? You need to see the predictions before you read the arguments. That's a bad signal. Ideally, you should be able to follow the logic, and then the prediction comes out naturally. If it doesn't, if you need to go to the hypothesis to understand the arguments, this is not the way it should work, right? So that's signaling some problem. What is going on? Maybe the purpose of that section or the order of those sections of the arguments is not designed in the right way. Maybe the meta-narrative, the purpose of that specific section or the purpose of that specific paragraph is not clear. Each paragraph should have a role, and the role of that paragraph is not clear. So you feel that you're reading the theory and you feel lost because there seems to be some missing pieces there, and you need to move forward to see what are they going to be predicting. Otherwise, I won't be able to understand what they're saying, right? So these are some of the problems I think I find as a reader. Now I'm going to give you a couple of pieces of advice of how I try to avoid these problems or fix them when they arise. The first one is that I try to write papers like this term. I don't know if it exists or not, maybe it does. It's onion writing type of writing, which is you start from like different layers and you go from the more broader bigger layers to the inside of it, right? So first you want to think about each of the sections, how you want to structure them. The good thing about academic papers is that we usually have a clear structure. This changes across journals, but in general, we know that there's an introduction, maybe there's a context section, and there's a theory with hypotheses, the methods have the sample, measurement, estimation, results, etc. So we know these broad sections, right? So what I try to do is I think at the paper at the broader possible level, and in the introduction, I know there's going to be these different elements, right? In the introduction, maybe I want to start first with stating what the topic is, so the phenomenon. Then I'm going to start writing about what people have done about this, what kind of findings do we see in the literature. Then I want to talk about the weaknesses or the limitations and identify some puzzles or dilemmas or whatever. Then I'm going to talk about what I'm going to do in the paper to address those dilemmas. So you have a clear understanding of the structure of each of these sections. Then you go in each of these subsections and you try to organize them. So maybe in the theory, there's a section where I'm going to be explaining the theory I'm going to use in this paper. This is a paper about, I don't know, alliances, and I'm going to use TCE, right? Transaction cost economics. Okay, this section and where I'm going to explain transaction cost economics, I'm going to start by explaining the underlying assumptions, the important question that I'm going to be using or asking here, which is governance mode. Then I'm going to start talking about the different assumptions, how they fit. And I need to have a schematic structure of the different parts that go in this subsection. And then you have these different paragraphs, and you go paragraph by paragraph, and you start filling it up and explaining each sentence has its role, and you start explaining the different parts of the paragraph. So the way I think about this, I start from the bigger picture and I start narrowing down and filling up the holes. This is the way it works for me, but maybe it's because my background is as an engineer and I need to see the big picture and the different schematic structures before moving forward. If I need to start writing from scratch, for me, it's impossible. There's no way I can do that. Now, avoiding these problems is maybe something you want to try to do, but the problem is that sometimes you are so embedded, so inside the project, it's very hard for you to understand what's wrong with it. And you don't know how the reader will approach that. Olivier was talking about this, right? That we want to have a very clear understanding of what is in the mind of the reader. And it's very hard for you if you're too much into the paper, right? So you want to have an outside view of these, right? You want the paper to be read by an outsider. Of course, getting friendly reviews is super useful, but something I try to do myself is become an outsider myself. I try to forget about the paper. I put the paper in a drawer for a month or something like that, and then I go back. Usually in a month, after 1 month, I've forgotten everything about the paper, so I can read it as a sort of an external reader, and this usually helps me identify some of these problems I was pointing at. So this is all from my side. Hopefully, if you have any questions later, I can address those. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Luis. Now we're going to have Giada go next.
Thank you, Aldona. Okay, so I actually have no slides. I decided to organize my thoughts around two main topics, which I think, again, are complementary to what the previous speakers talked about. One topic is related to setting the stage for writing, and so the things related to time management and actually getting the writing done. And the second set of tips is mostly related to style. And I come to this very much with the perspective of a non-native speaker who had to somehow learn the craft of writing academic papers. So let's start with the getting it done. So the time management. Okay, so let me start by saying that writing may mean different things in the sense that when we talk about writing, we may think about writing a paper from scratch. And so there are very important lessons to be learned there with respect to the structure. There are many, I think, super wonderful sources that also we can use, both things that have been written or videos that we have also available at STR. I will share some in the chat. So there is a lot to learn about really writing something from scratch. Now, how do you write from scratch? It's a matter of taste, but in general, for me, this requires having enough time, not to feel too much pressure. So it's good to have deadlines for sure. The Academy of Management deadline is approaching fast. I usually use that as a way to force me to write papers, especially when they are at the beginning. But then in general, I really think I need to set away a couple of days in which I can just really focus on the writing so that there is some sort of deadline. I want to get something out of it, but I also will not feel as a complete failure if after 2 hours I have nothing but a paragraph if I'm lucky. So writing from scratch is a type of writing. And then there is the writing that it requires less of this sort of immersive. I'm going to get lost in my thoughts. And this is when it comes, for instance, to replying to referee reports once you have already addressed or know how to address the points, which can be done also in terms of sketching, things that you can also do in, I have an hour and I'm going to use this time to actually make progress. To me, psychologically, this idea of making progress, even if it's a little progress every day or every week, depending on how busy I am in a particular point in time, makes a huge difference, because otherwise I feel like I'm sitting on papers without making any progress for too long. Blocking out the 2 days, blocking off the 2 days sometimes may be too ambitious of a goal. But if I make little progress on things that are easier to do, I'm going to fix this intro, I'm going to start answering the review comments, etc. This somehow helps tremendously. There are also different types of writings in terms of whether writing is about facts. So when you describe your method or the model specification, the experimental design that you used, this is writing that can be done easily, and that every time I feel like I've not made enough progress, I can actually work on that so that I can feel that I can make a lot of progress fast. This is so much easier compared to writing the intro of your paper clearly or a discussion section. And by the way, I use the intro and discussion section here not by chance, because just as a side note, we spend a tremendous amount of effort of intros and kind of leave the discussions at this sort of thing that you do once you are sick and tired of a paper. And I would really like you to think about this sometimes and maybe start rereading a paper from the discussion instead of the intro when you're revising it to make the discussion also stronger. Don't let it go. The discussion is a place for you also to say important things. Now, different ways to write from scratch, revising versus factual versus more, the generative part. There is also something that is related to how a paper is written more broadly. So we tend to think, I think, of papers as this sort of fitting into this hypodidactic framework that we are used to see in each single contribution. And nowadays, more and more, we read papers that are written in different ways, that are more abductive in nature, where we present the findings and the intuitions about the theory at the same time that we are presenting what we actually are doing in the paper. This raises a whole set of new challenges, I think, because somehow it requires us to find prototypes that I think we still don't have enough of. So if you are thinking about adopting a more abductive approach to writing, I think this is an open field to some extent, and it's a little bit more difficult because there are not many examples out there. Again, in the spirit of the resources, there was a very interesting workshop in the summer about this topic. And again, I'm going to post the link to that in the resources, in the chat. Okay, so in terms of managing this, sometimes I block times with myself on my schedule to make sure that I somehow prevent some parts of my day or some parts of my week to be booked with other events. Sometimes I find that a little bit depressing, especially when I'm not able to manage this commitment, and somehow, you know, honor it. But I try to do that every now and then, especially if I have a deadline coming. It helps me mentally to see my week planning the weekend before and think, okay, so I'm going to use Friday morning for writing. And this may change depending on the week. I know of some very productive colleagues who actually have a writing day every week. I don't know if this applies or works for everyone. It doesn't really work for me, but again, there are tricks there. Now, I was sitting in another panel a couple of days ago with very successful junior scholars, and Seth Carnan was giving tips about when to stop writing. That is, he talked about the fact that sometimes when he's writing, he prefers to stop when he knows where he's going to start the next time he opens a manuscript, instead of stopping at the point where you're done with saying what you wanted to say, and somehow you have to start from scratch next time you sit and open the paper. I totally agree with this advice. On top of this, I will share my ridiculous, I think, tip to do that. What I usually do once I'm stopping is I record a voice message on my phone, usually like a voice note, in which I basically somehow recap the reasoning I'm going through the moment in which I'm stopping. I can take notes, but I find that taking notes in written form sometimes is not as helpful. So somehow it's kind of like a memo for myself. Like, okay, so I'm stopping here. What I was saying is this, what I should say next is this. And I just, you know, talk it out so that next time, sometimes I also may copy some of the sentences that I used in the voice message, and it somehow helps me to get started. So whatever helps you to get started, because I think that's part of the challenge. Okay, about the style, I'm also a non-native speaker, as I'm sure you can say by now. So this means that I also have to learn to somehow how to write in the language that was not my own. And I thought I was decent at writing English before I entered academia and discovered that this is really a different language. I totally agree with Olivier on this. And also English is very different from Italian in the way in which it is written. So I'm thinking back to how I used to write at the beginning. I'm sure that this was very painful to all of my co-authors. So how did I get started? I think the way for me to learn was really like working with people who had this habit of editing the drafts that we had, keeping the edits tracked so that I could basically see all the changes. And I was going to produce the first drafts, but then they would butcher whatever I was doing without any mercy, so that whatever I was trying to say was going to be turned into things that made more sense given the constraints of the language that I was writing in. So Margie Petera, for instance, I think was one of the first people with whom I wrote, used to say that she had to go with an axe through whatever I had written in order to transform it into something readable. But this was extremely helpful for me because it really taught me somehow the craft of how you write. In the absence of mentors who can guide you through the process, I think a very helpful thing to do, and I still do this now, when I read papers, if a paper speaks to me also because of the way in which it is written, I take a note. So I somehow save files of papers just because they have a beautiful intro. And maybe I will not use that, but at some point in time, if I want to get inspired about like a beautiful intro to write, I would go and take a look at that. So if I see something that really catches my eye, I set it aside in this folder, and sometimes I'm very precise with this, sometimes I'm not, but the basic idea is you learn by imitation, you learn by looking at what others do, and you learn also through mentorship, which I think is important, because in the end, writing is not most of the times a solitary act with co-authors, which also means that I think at the beginning of a co-authorship relationship, you may want to be very clear with your co-authors about your writing style. So for instance, the people I work with know that I'm going to edit the manuscript without any mercy. So if I think something that I have written is not clear, I'm going to rewrite it, not thinking about whether they can get hurt, that I changed their sentences or worked on their prose. It's the paper, it's for the good of the paper, so they know that this is how I work. So this may depend again on your co-authors, but it's something important. And then copy editors. Long live the copy editors. So I use copy editors on everything, on the papers, but also on editing responses to reviewers. So my copy editor also looks at that. Once she has read the paper so that she knows what I'm talking about. And this helps tremendously, because I think it's super important also for me, in the sense that sometimes, you know, I may get sloppy towards the end of a paper, or I may not know of some other ways to talk about, like, how to deliver a thought effectively, and the native speaker is super important. And by the way, I must say that I also work with a lot of, I've been working in the past, especially with a lot of native speakers, and they also used to work with copy editors. So this is not something just for non-native speakers. It's an advantage that you may want to use. Also because, by the way, as an editor, I can see that reviewers get very, how can I say, not emotional, but I would say they're not very happy. They are a little bit annoyed when they start seeing typos and mistakes, like stupid mistakes in papers, especially if they come in the intro. So the intro is really like this card that you're showing to your readers. And the moment in which I find a half-cut sentence in an intro, or I start seeing some, you know, typos, this really speaks very badly. And I know this, I should not take this as a signal, but it kind of comes, I think, unconsciously as a signal of sloppiness to some extent on the side of the authors, especially in an intro. So you want to avoid that, because I think you want to signal that you have put, you really want to show all the immense amount of hours that you've put in writing the papers. And sometimes, you know, these little details don't allow you to really show that. Now, given the way in which Italian is, one thing that I really need to learn a lot about not doing was to insert, you know, a lot of, like, making these sentences that are basically like paragraphs. So how to fix that? And here I'm borrowing a tip from one of my advisors. So Andy King, what he used to do with me was actually, we would sit and read aloud sections of the paper, to basically, so that he could show me that he was somehow not able to catch his breath, and he was getting choked by having to read these very, very long sentences. He would do this just to show me somehow that, like, what was the problem with the writing sometimes. But I've used this habit, and I actually picked this habit. So now I read aloud the papers when I'm going through, you know, when I read to write different sections, because I really feel that just like by reading it out loud, I notice mistakes that I would not notice if I were just to read it. We tend to speak a lot using jargon, which again, I would try to avoid as much as possible. And we have all these, you know, we insert all these citations in parentheses in many different parts in a sentence. Once you start reading it, sometimes it sucks. So you really want to make sure that you read it out loud to yourself so that you can avoid that. And I think this is it. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Yeah, this was wonderful. We now have Caroline who goes next. So I just wanted to say, I've been taking voice notes for all kinds of things recently, and now I have the proof that is the right thing to do. I'll follow your advice. Okay, Caroline.
Well, thanks so much. It's been very enlightening listening to my three co-panelists here, and actually I'm learning a lot as well. I had no idea that my limited vocabulary is actually a benefit in writing. So thank you, Olivier. All right, let me try to be complimentary here and add my perspective. I do think there's quite a bit of overlap overall, but it might just look at it from slightly different perspective. As you noticed, Louise and I had a very active conversation about hiking up or down the mountain. It's all a matter of perspective at the end of the day. But I would like us to take a step back, actually, and not just to think about writing per se. Okay, I think very often we as academic scholars think about writing and paper for the sake of publishing, for the sake of publishing, instead of what are we actually really doing, and what are we trying to answer, what are we trying to understand in the real world. And so my suggestion, this is, I do have a point here. I would recommend to start with a bigger picture, be it the mountaintop that you want to hike up, or be it something, whatever you want. But in a sense of start with a big picture question. What is the research question? Okay, and then why? What is the research gap? Engage with the existing literature. So very much in line with Louise's comments about, kind of what is this. This boils down to the structure of how do you write the paper, how do I write the paper at the end of the day. But it's also a way how I think about research before I even select the project, which project to work on, what research questions to focus on. I go through what I call the Flammer's research protocol. And I know there were a couple of questions in the chat about how do you structure an introduction, etc. If you think about it, this is basically paragraph by paragraph. Each one of these questions represents a paragraph in my introduction at the end of the day. So one is, somehow I added some dynamics here. So what is your research question? Then what is the research gap? And then very important, why on earth is it important to close this gap? Why should anybody care? Sorry, I messed up my presentation somehow. I'm not sure where those dynamics came from, but why is it important? What is the economic significance in the real world? Why should we care? Drive that point home. Then what is the theoretical argument? How do you measure your theoretical constructs? What is your identification strategy? If you don't have identification, just how do you go about it to empirically test it? What are the results? How do you interpret the results? Arguably, this directly links back to also why is it important to close the gap and the implications for practice. Again, this loops back to why is it important to close the gap? Why do you even ask the question in the first place? Okay, and so this is actually very much also how I structure my papers and how I structure the introductions. And then the second point I'd like to make is about language. It was pointed out before about language. Let me stop sharing. I do think language is important, and I'm not sure it matters whether you're a non-native speaker or not. Quite frankly, I've had co-authors, both non-native speaker and native speaker. I'm not sure I would rank any of them higher in terms of, I'm not sure it's so much more beneficial to work with a native speaker. I think what is important that you're careful and that each paragraph makes sense. Each sentence makes sense. The sequence of sentence makes sense, that you're careful, regardless of whether you're a native speaker or not. And it takes time to write. Don't be lazy. And I agree with Louise and Olivier when you said, maybe having 3 sentences that basically say the same thing but in different ways, that's a signal. Don't be lazy. Write one sentence that really captures what you want to say to the point. And it takes time. Take the time. There's no such thing like a quick paper. There's no such thing like a quick writing. It just takes time. And I think you need to allow yourself the time. So this is about logic and flow of the arguments to some extent. Another aspect is the language, correct? I would recommend use a language that is understood by the audience. It's not just about American English or British English or whatever. It's also, I would recommend to stay away from any kind of academic language that nobody else understands except for the very few 5 other scholars who are exactly working in your space, because it limits your audience. It limits the potential impact of your study. It limits the potential impact you can have on the world, if you think about it. So I'm going to do a natural experiment with you. Some of you already know it, but wenn ich jetzt mit euch auf Schweizerdeutsch rede, versteht mich sehr schön niemand, oder? Falls ich nun auf Hochdeutsch mit euch rede, versteht mich jemand? Si parlo italiano, c'è alguna personas que me capiscent. Si je parle en français, il y en a plus que me comprennent, ¿verdad? ¿N'est-ce pas? Ok. Si hablo en español, hay unos más que me entienden. Now, if I speak in English, I assume everybody understands me. Why on earth would you write a paper in Swiss German? You limit your audience to two people in this world. So speak a language that is understood across disciplines, not just across management, but across disciplines, and also with the broader audience. Again, going back to why do you do research? Is it really to just communicate to other scholars for the sake of publication? Or is it to have an impact in this world and to hopefully help improve and tackle some of the grand societal challenges that we are facing and inform managers, inform policymakers, and have an impact? And I think you're more likely to be able to do so if you actually use a language that is well understood. Keep it simple. I totally subscribe to what Olivier said. Keep it simple. No need to go fancy with words, but use a clear language. And I stop here.
Thanks so much, Caroline, and thank you so much to everyone on the panel. So I know we have very limited time. If we still have a couple of minutes, I would ask the question posers to unmute themselves and ask their question in turn, and then whoever from the panel wants to take the question can actually go ahead and do so. So we had a question on introductions by Michael, and then about friendly reviews by Tig, and then about rewriting by Thomas. So if we can go in that order, I apologize if I missed anybody. We can just kind of fire shoot our questions and then fire respond. Thanks.
Okay. Can people hear me? Okay, so yeah, just wanted to thank the organizers and panelists for this great insightful session. So my question was about the introduction. We always hear about how important it is, but also hear that it's more of an art than a science. So it's really hard to nail down a process that works for everyone all the time. But I was just curious to hear from both a writer's and an editor's perspective. As accomplished academic writers yourselves, is there a particular process that you tend to go through? And as an editor, are there some common traits that you often come across in very good introduction, as well as some less satisfying introduction? Thank you.
Tig.
Oh, thank you very much, Aldona, and many thanks to our four panelists. I more wanted to tap into the panelists' perspectives as accomplished scholars and writers in their own right, and I'm keen to hear perspectives on what makes it the best friendly reviewers. And thank you, Caroline, for already adding some perspectives on that in the chat.
Just quickly, so quick question: how's the process of rewriting a paper different than the process of writing a paper from scratch? And how would you go about like reframing, changing the way you report results? Just that's the question. Thank you so much, Aldona, and everyone.
Thanks to the question askers. So now if our panelists just want to take a question in turn, please go ahead. Caroline.
So let me perhaps touch on the two last questions in terms of picking your friendly reviewers as well as rewriting the study. So what has helped me a lot in previous years is have two reading groups of about 4 people in total. All of us come from different disciplinary backgrounds. Okay, so I think my PhD is in economics. I think I have a good sense of what an economist will tell me about where the potential weaknesses are, misunderstandings, etc. I'm being my devil's advocate to myself, okay? But talking to someone who's trained in sociology, psychology, management, it's amazing to me sometimes what apparently I communicate with the words I choose. And so by asking them for feedback, those kind of two reading groups were really critical for me to help improve the studies in terms of just the content itself, but also the writing. And there are some pitfalls you can avoid by actually talking to other folks who might understand a certain term differently. Just to give you a concrete example, for example, moral hazard. I had a study on moral hazard, and we called it CSR moral hazard. I had no idea that moral hazard could be meaning anything differently than, you know, agency theory, kind of moral hazard, until I realized, audience, I know you're smart people, but whatever feedback you're giving me makes absolutely no sense. So I asked, what do you understand when I say moral hazard? And the answer is the temptation to engage in unethical behavior, moral hazard. And so you clearly, immediately see, first of all, how brainwashed I am as an economist, but also that maybe we need to use a different term in order to speak to a broader audience and get the point across that we actually want to make. And so, you know, and so we change the language. So this goes also then in terms of framing the paper, reframing the study, by talking to different people, getting feedback from different audiences. You quickly realize where you may need to preempt potential concerns because they are not concerns, but you want to preempt them, and then potentially, you know, you mention certain paragraphs or certain aspects earlier in the study than later. I hope that's helpful.
If I may add something there, so to the first and the third questions, if I didn't misunderstood the order. So with respect to the first one, I disagree with the sentence that writing the introduction is more an art than a science. At least to me, is the most scientific part of the whole paper, is the one I spend more time on, and the one for which I have more of a clear structure of. And I think Caroline gave a very clear summary of how this looks like, because I sort of agree with Caroline that Caroline, I do have like a specific purpose for every paragraph in the intro, right? So I would disagree that this is more of an art than a science, and there's been some resources provided in the chat. There's lots of very useful pieces of advice out there. So I think this is, I mean, just practicing and having a very clear understanding of what you want to achieve in every single paragraph of the introduction, right? With respect to Thomas' question about rewriting, here I agree a lot with what Olivier was saying in his talk about 10% being throwing stuff into the blank paper, and then 90% of the time is rewriting and polishing and rewriting. So in that sense, I don't think it's that different. It's true that if this comes after a review and you need to make some substantial changes, maybe you want to take a step back and remove some parts so you don't get trapped into the inertia of what you wrote in the first version. But it's not that different. This trade-off between going very deep and very inside the paper to understand what is the next subtle thing you need to change, and at the same time taking a step back and try to see the big picture, that back and forth happens. And I think this was the discussion Caroline and I were having in the chat. You need to keep doing this, even if it's a rewriting because of an R&R or a rejection or whatever, or it's simply the first draft. You need to keep doing this. And as I said, I agree with Olivier completely on this. For me, it's 90% rewriting and polishing after you throw some stuff there.
Yeah, so just would like to agree with Luis again, because it's we have a nice mutual admiration society. I think that, yeah, the introduction I was thinking the same. No, it's stereotypical. There are templates. Just follow the template. It is an art to write it concisely and artfully at the level of the language, but in terms of structure, that's almost a straitjacket. At the point where, but maybe you need someone to go with you. Look, this paragraph does this and this paragraph does that. It's not necessarily easy to understand what each paragraph does and what is the purpose. And you need probably someone to really go through it. And it can vary almost by journal and by discipline, but that's stereotypical. That's really, it's formulaic, there are templates, follow the template. And then what is hard is to make it in easy language to read, as opposed to something that's hard to read. And for rewriting, I would just add that sometimes you should not hesitate to kill your most cherished babies, and that you have to be ruthless. I mean, you have a great idea that no one seems to understand. You can persevere, but sometimes in the paper you have to pick the things that people are interested in, and you're not necessarily the best judge of what's important in your ideas. And that doesn't mean you have to go with the wind, but sometimes it's good to listen to the feedback in that respect.
Let me build on this so that we keep with the tradition of building on each other's points about the rewriting. So if I understood correctly, Tomas's question, it was really related to having to reframe a paper. So we really need to take a step back and think of the paper in a different way. So this is very difficult. I totally agree, because I mean, you get to a paper in a way in which it's like thinking of it in a certain way, and then they are asking you to somehow look at it with different eyes. And as the creator of the first version, it's very difficult to switch to the second. So what I find useful to do there before I start writing is, of course, I mean, you need to get familiar with the literature that you are going to reframe the paper in. And what I really think is important is talk to people. So this actually builds a bit on what also Caroline was saying. So I tend to do short presentations, but like also in terms of like quick pitches of how I would rewrite the paper. So, you know, I have this paper and I would try to just say, you know, and it's a paper about, and I would try with a different framing and see how people react to this change. How people react, meaning my colleagues over coffee or someone that I encounter. I mean, I understand it's a little bit more difficult now, but maybe, you know, some colleagues you're closer with who would actually also be willing to do this for you, and then you may be willing to do that for them, which brings me to the friendly reviewers. So I usually do this only with people I know very well personally, who I think are very relevant for the paper, either because of the target journal that I have in mind or because of the positioning in terms of the literature. It's really like to get feedback. And what I would usually ask these people is for specific feedback. I find it very daunting of a task when people send me a paper and say, can you give me feedback on the paper? Which is like, I need to go through the entire manuscript, and it's like, it's a lot of work. But if someone asks me, would you read the intro? Does it make sense? What do you see? This is much easier to do. So if you want to get this feedback, try to be specific in the requests, because it's a lot of time that you're asking out of other people. So ask for small tasks, and that is usually something that nobody will tell you no to.
Thanks so much to the question askers and to the panelists. I'm very mindful of the panelists and everyone's time. So as a tradition, we have to take the mandatory STR photo together. So if people who can unmute their cameras, basically turn on their cameras, we'll take a photo, and then whoever can stay for another hour of writing together, that'd be great. We can also keep talking in the chat. And otherwise, I'm just very grateful for all these insights. I took a lot of notes. Okay, so I'm going to be taking photos. If I'll just smile, I'll have a couple of screens, so just keep smiling. Okay, great. Thanks so much, everybody. This was very insightful, very helpful to myself, and I hope to many others. As I said, many of us will hopefully stay around for another hour. Thank you to our panelists, and just a round of applause for your time, your insights, your generous sharing today. Thank you.